Halo, halo, počujeme sa? Výborne, všetko funguje. Príjemný, dobrý večer. Veľmi sa teším, že sme sa tu zišli v takejto celkom početnej zostave na pomery bratislavských kultúrnych a predovšetkým literárnych akcií. Tento úvod je po slovensky, ale chcem upozorniť, že dnešný večer prebehne v angličtine. Vraj sa na to upozorňovalo na Facebooku, ale nie som si tým istý, tak v prípade, ak by ste nerozumeli, tak sa veľmi ospravedlňujeme, ale knižka samozrejme aktuálne vyšla v slovenskom preklade a zaznie tu na úvod i ukážka v oboch týchto rečiach. Ja sa veľmi teším, že tu môžem privítať nemecko-britskú autorku, ktorá s touto svojou zdvojenou identitou pracuje i vo svojom debute, ktorý vyvolal skutočne veľké ohlasy a v podstate i mnoho kontroverzií o tom, prečo tu ešte dnes bude reč. Bol preložený už do takmer 20 jazykov a v anglickom origináli sa volal The Appointment, s tým, že slovenský preklad si požičal akoby sekundárny titul Jewish Cock. Predpokladám, že prekladateľka Daniela Krnáčová, ktorá pre literárnu baštu túto knižku preložila, ponechala ten titul v angličtine, pretože ak by sme ho preložili do slovenčiny, viem si predstaviť, že by to ľudí výrazne poburovalo. Veľmi sa teším, že po včerajšej besede v Diere do sveta na festivale Mobilis v Liptovskom Mikuláši môžem dnes aj tu v Romerovom dome privítať Katharínu Volckmer. A teraz prepínam do angličtiny. That was my very short introduction, very similar to yesterday, except for the fact that I mentioned that yesterday actually happened. And now I think to start, we can read a bit the beginning of the book.
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. Reading from an iPad for the first time ever, so it's a premiere. I know that this might not be the best moment to bring this up, Dr. Seligman, but it just came to my mind that I once dreamt that I was Hitler. I feel embarrassed talking about it even now, but I really was him, overlooking a mass of fanatical followers. I delivered a speech from a balcony. Wearing the uniform with the funny, puffy legs, I could feel the little moustache on my upper lip, and my right hand was flying through the air as I mesmerized everyone with my voice. I don't remember what exactly I was talking about. I think it had something to do with Mussolini and some absurd dream of expansion, but that doesn't matter. What is fascism anyway but ideology for its own sake? It carries no message, and in the end the Italians beat us to it. I can't walk for more than 100 meters in this city without seeing the words pasta or espresso, and their ghastly flag is hanging from every corner. I never see the word sauerkraut anywhere. It was never feasible for us to hold down an empire for 1,000 years with our deplorable cuisine. There are limits to what you can impose on people, and anyone would break free after a second serving of what we call food. It was always our weak point. We never created anything that was meant to be enjoyed without a higher purpose. It is not for nothing that there is no word for pleasure in German. We only know lust and joy. Our throats never get wet enough to suck anyone with devotion because we were all raised on too much dry bread. You know that horrible bread we eat and tell everyone about like some sort of self-perpetuating myth? I think it's a punishment from God for all the crimes we have committed. And forthwith, nothing as sensual as a baguette or as moist as a blueberry muffin they serve here will ever come out of that country. It's one of the reasons I had to leave. I no longer wanted to be complicit in the bread lie. But anyway, as I was delivering what we would now have to call a hate speech, I felt that the orgastic applause coming from beneath me only served as poor compensation for my obvious deformities. I was so painfully aware that I looked nothing like the Aryan ideal I had been going on about for all those years. I mean, I did not have a club foot, but still, not all of the dead Jews in the world, nor even my alleged vegetarianism, would make me eligible for one of those hot Riefenstahl pigs. I felt like a fraud. Had no one noticed that I looked like an old potato with plastic hair? I can still feel the sadness I woke up with that day. The sadness of knowing that I would never get to be one of those beautiful blonde German boys with their Greek bodies and that skin that turned so wonderfully golden in the sun. The feeling that I would never be what I felt I should have been. I don't want to say that I felt sorry for Hitler, and it's still not acceptable to wipe out an entire civilization because you feel unhappy in your body and because they represent what you hate about yourself. But it did make me think about his private life. Hitler's every day. Have you ever thought about the Führer in his pajamas, Dr. Seligman? Waking up with messy hair, stumbling across the room, looking for his slippers. I'm sure some sad person has written a book about his domestic life, but I much prefer to imagine it myself. Books would only find a way to make it dull. I can see the swastika-themed bed sheets and matching pajamas, everything down to his breakfast bowl. I saw those once in Poland in one of those weird antique shops entirely dedicated to the memorabilia of their tormentors, where they were selling bowls and plates with tiny swastikas at the bottom. It almost felt like some sort of perverted Barbie universe, where if you saved long enough, you could buy a whole new life, shiny and matching. I could even imagine little TV spots with a well-oiled Hitler doll on one of those glittering horses, saving a good German woman from the hands of some leering Jew, riding off into the sunset, the race protected and safe. Savvy as they were when it came to the media, I think the Nazis really missed out on a marketing opportunity there. Imagine all the fun the little German children could have had with something like a Lego concentration camp called Freudenstadt. Build your own oven, organize your own deportations, and don't forget to conquer enough Lebensraum. They could even have gone for an adult line. Aside from all the gloves and lampshades they made from skin, they could have had horse-themed butt plugs made from real enemy hair. But I guess that ship has sailed now. And I don't mean to offend you, Dr. Seligman, especially now that you have your head between my legs, but don't you think that there's something kinky about genocide?
Uvedomujem si, že nie je práve najvhodnejšia chvíľa vyťahovať to, doktor Seligman, no spomenula som si, ako sa mi raz snívalo, že som Hitler. Ešte aj teraz, keď vám o tom hovorím, sa cítim trápne, no naozaj som ním bola, z balkóna som prednášala svoju reč pred zástupom fanatických stúpencov. Mala som oblečenú uniformu so smiešnými zdúrenými nohavicami, nad hornou perou ma šteklili drobné fúzy a zatiaľ, čo som všetkých uchvacovala svojim hlasom, ruka mi vírila vzduch. Nespomínam si, o čom som hovorila. Tuším, to malo niečo spoločné s Mussolínim a akousi absurdnou túžbou po expanzii, ale na tom napokon nezáleží. Fašizmus nie je nič viac, než len samoučelná ideológia, nenesie nejaké posolstvo a Taliani nás v tom nakoniec aj tak premohli. Človek v tomto meste neprejde viac než 100 metrov bez toho, aby niekde nezahliadol slová pasta či espresso. Ešte aj ich otrasná zástava visí na každom rohu. Toto slovo sauerkraut nevidieť nikde. S našou žalostnou kuchyňou by sme si impérium na 1000 rokov nikdy nepodmanili. Existujú predsa určité hranice toho, čomu môžete ľudí vystaviť a každý, komu by ste druhý raz ponúkli to, čo tu nazývame jedlom, by radšej zobral nohy na plecia. Vždy to bola naša slabá stránka. Nikdy sme nič nevytvorili čisto pre potešenie, všetko muselo mať vznešenejší účel. Nie nadarmo v nemčine neexistuje slovo pre pôžitok, poznáme iba túžbu a radosť. Naše hrdlá nikdy nezvlhnú natoľko, aby sme niekomu oddane vyfajčili, pretože sme odchovaní na suchom chlebe. Poznáte ten príšerný chlieb, ktorý jeme a o ktorom všetkým rozprávame, ako by to bol nejaký nevyčerpateľný mýtus? Domnievam sa, že je to Boží trest za všetky zločiny, ktoré sme spáchali. A preto z tejto krajiny nikdy nevzíde niečo také zmyselné ako bageta alebo také vláčne ako čučorietkové mafiny, ktoré dostať tu. Aj to je jeden z dôvodov, prečo som musela odísť. Už som sa viac nechcela podieľať na tomto chlebovom podvode. V každom prípade som pri prednášaní toho, čo by sme dnes nazvali nenávistným prejavom, cítila, že vášnivý aplauz ozývajúci sa z dola iba chabo kompenzoval moje viditeľné deformity. Bolestivo som si uvedomovala, že sa ani trochu nepodobám na árijský ideál, o ktorom celé tie roky meliem. Nie, že by som mala konskú nohu, No ani všetci mŕtvi Židia, ba dokonca ani moje údajné vegetariánstvo by nestačilo na to, aby ma dostali do Riefenstahlovej zmyselných filmov. Pripadala som si ako podvodníčka. Vari si nikto nevšimol, že vyzerám ako starý zemiak s umelými vlasmi? Dodnes si presne pamätám smútok, ktorý som po prebudení cítila. Smútok z vedomia, že nikdy nebudem jedným z tých nádherných nemeckých chlapcov s telami gréckych svoch a pokožkou, ktorá sa pod slnečnými lúčmi mení na nádherne zlatú. Smútok z toho, že sa nikdy nestanem tým, čím som mala byť. Netvrdím, že mi je Hitlera ľúto. A určite nie je priateľné vyhľadiť celé etnikum len preto, že sa vo svojom tele necítite dobre a jeho príslušníci stelesňujú všetko, čo na sebe nenávidíte. No prinútilo ma to zamyslieť sa nad jeho súkromným životom, jeho každodennosťou. Predstavili ste si niekedy Führera v pyžame, doktor Seligman, ako sa prechádza z trapatý a tacká sa izbou, ako hľadá svoje papuče? Nejaká smutná osôbka už knihu o jeho súkromí určite napísala, ja si ho však oveľa radšej predstavím sama, knihy by ma iba ochudobnili. Už vidím tú postielnú bielizeň so svastikou, k nej ladiace pyžamo a všetko ostatné vrátane raňajkovej misky. Raz som takú videla v Poľsku, v jednom z tých čudných starožitníctiev plných pozostalostí po ich vlastných trízniteľoch, kde predávali misky a taniere pomalované zo spodu drobnými svastikami. Celé to pôsobilo ako akési zvrátené Barbie univerzum, v ktorom ste si, ak ste dosť dlho šetrili, mohli zaobstarať celkom nový život, žiarivý a dokonale zladený. Predstavujem si aj krátku televíznu reklamu, v ktorej veľkolepá bábka Hitlera na nablískanom koni zachraňuje dobrú Nemku z rúk chlípneho Žida. Potom spolu cválajú v ústrety zapadajúcemu slnku, rasa konečne zachránená a v bezpečí. Akokoľvek boli nacisti kreatívni, pokiaľ ide o médiá, v tomto prípade nepochybne premrhali marketingovú príležitosť. Len si predstavte, akú obrovskú zábavu by nemecké deti zažívali pri hre s niečím ako Lego koncentračný tábor s názvom Freudenstadt. Postav si vlastnú pec, zorganizuj deportácie a nezabudni vydobiť čo najviac Lebensraumu. A mohli zacieliť aj na dospelé publikum. Okrem všetkých rukavíc a tienidiel z kože mohli mať análne kolíky s konskou tematikou, vyrobené z pravých vlasov nepriateľa. Ale túto možnosť už prepásli. Nechcem vás uraziť, doktor Seligman, najmenej teraz, keď máte hlavu medzi mojimi nohami. No nezdá sa vám genocída tak trochu vzrušujúco perverzná? So those were the first 3 pages of your book, and I think everyone understands now why it was controversial, among other things. But there is a sort of shock value to the first pages, but when you read more, it becomes a book about a struggle with your own identity, with the identity of the narrator and her inability to be a part of the world she was born into. Maybe my very first question is, can you tell the people here who haven't read the book yet, at least most of them, how you conceived this idea? Because I think it's a very brave combination of motives and themes and topics for a first book.
So I think, to sum it up quite briefly, I think I'm very interested in the identity that comes with a body, I think, and on the different levels that a body constitutes an identity, I think, because it's gender, but it's also nationality, it's language, because, you know, it's random, but it has obviously a lot of effects. And then I was interested in what happens when you try to change the identity that comes with a body. That's kind of the abstract, I think, thinking behind it. But this was born out of, I wrote a short story once in an apartment in Berlin, and it was quite strong, I think, but it was already this voice talking to this doctor. And then we decided to turn it into a novel. But I think it was always this idea of what happens when you are unhappy with your given identity. And obviously in this case it's a German identity, so that makes it quite complex, I think. And so, yeah, I think that's, you know, where it comes from. And yeah, we should probably say that the beginning she's quite provocative, I guess. She's sort of testing the eyes. She's uncomfortable, but there's a movement, I think, in the story, and she learns to embrace her own vulnerability. I think in many ways it's a journey towards vulnerability, but towards finding strength in that. And also, I don't want to spoiler it too much, but she finds herself physically in a position of weakness, I guess. And it's, I think, metaphorically speaking, a position that a lot of women or female bodies or non-male bodies find themselves in. And I think she manages to find strength in that weakness. So, yeah.
The whole book is written as a monologue, and you just said that, yeah, at the beginning she says very shocking things, but when I was reading it, I felt like all of these shocking things are just her sort of system of defense against the world and against the people there. And then, as you said, when she embraces her vulnerability and when she sort of loses her guard, I feel like it suddenly becomes very dark and very, very sensitive. How did you sort of balance these two aspects? Because it's very funny in some places, and then it just gets very, very intense and very emotional.
I think they need each other, these two moods, because I think if you just had one or the other, it wouldn't really work. Like, I think if it was, because I didn't want it to be like a stand-up show, because obviously you could just have an hour of of these kind of jokes, but I think that would be too shallow, I think, or that wouldn't really be the full journey. But as you said, I think that the humor has many functions, but it is her defense mechanism, and she sort of kind of clings to it until the end, but at the very end she lets go of it, I think. But I also think it's a cliche, but I think we need humor now to face this kind of darkness, because she goes to places that are very dark, I think, and I think it's like her torchlight, or it's like it's almost the thing that allows her to do it, I think. So it's important, and I myself find it quite hard to just be serious, you know. I have this thing that I always try to make people laugh. It's like a compulsion, I don't know. But I think it's kind of the only way, because otherwise you can only cry, and that's boring, I think. So you need the humor, yeah.
The book is quite radical in a lot of ways. It's radically queer and radically feminist, but I like that how you work with these themes and with these topics in a very reversed sort of way. When it comes to the feminism, she actually shows a lot of hate for women in her life, and while also acknowledging that the hate basically comes from the fact that women are perceived as weak, and the way their place in society works. How are you thinking about these opposites? I don't want to spoil the queer line, but it also works as sort of a reverse of what we would expect.
Yeah, I think it's because I think things are more complex than they're often portrayed, no? And I always get very worked up when I hear things like empowerment, you know, so I'm like, no, fuck this. This is like, it's kind of how it maybe works on Instagram, but I think real life is much more complex than that. And I think I was interested in how female relations, and obviously in this case the mother-daughter relationship, is a place where patriarchal structures are perpetuated, I think, where a lot of pain comes from those relationships, I think. And I think it's also important to show weakness, and I think it's also important to show that people often act out of fear, you know. But I think unless you talk about that, I don't think it's going to change, because we're not all going to wake up and be empowered. Also, it's a grammatically problematic construction, I think, because who empowered you, you know? So yeah, I don't know. And the, yeah, we can't really spoiler the queer aspect, but I think the queer aspect for me was also this, it has a lot to do with this authority over your own body and this idea of building yourself in a way, you know, in a sense that you are born one way, and especially I think for women, the society then wants you to be a certain way, and she manages to liberate herself from that quite radically, admittedly, but it's this power that you can find over your own body, which I think is something incredibly powerful if you manage to find it.
You were born and raised in Germany, and when you were 19, you moved to the UK. This book, a large part of it deals with German identity and German collective guilt and the way it affects the protagonist. Do you think that you needed this sort of British perspective to write it like this?
Yes, I think so. I think it's a linguistic distance that I have that allows me to... It's also a stupid cliche, but it's very hard to be funny in German, I think. There's something about the language. It's really stupid to say that, I know, but I find it much, much harder. Because there's something about English, it's very condensed, and you can sort of... I don't know, I can be funnier there. And there was also something interesting, because I did, of course, at one point in my life think I should be a writer from Berlin and write things in German. And they were really terrible, like really, I think objectively really bad. And this is much closer to I think who I am now. So I think it's quite close to my identity, I think. But also I think you need this perspective of living abroad to really see where you're coming from and to really understand what you are, I think. Because I think as long as you're within something, you're inside of it, you're never going to see it. No, you're kind of blind. So, and then you can never unsee it. Like when I go to Germany now, it's I see a lot of things, maybe too many things, but I see a lot, and I find it disturbing. And I think it's normal. It's the experience of the foreigner, the stranger, and also obviously because in Britain I'll never be a Brit, so you're always kind of in between. But I think it's a comfortable spot for seeing and observing. Yeah.
The book got translated and published in Germany eventually, but I know that it was a struggle and the process was quite long. It was very difficult to find a publisher in Germany, and for obvious reasons there were problems. So what I find interesting is that we usually perceive Germans like people who sort of were able to deal with their past and they're okay with it now, and yeah, they're much wiser now and they're doing stuff right. But still, this book, I can imagine that it angered a lot of people from Germany and it sort of hurt them in a way. Why do you think it still happens? Why isn't it something that they can look as like from a wider perspective?
Well, I think precisely because they thought because, you know, there's this word Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which means coming to terms with your past. And I think it's a very problematic word because it means that it's like something final, like it's like a box you tick and then you move on. And I think they don't like to be reminded about all the ways in which I think they haven't done this, and also I think it's a stupid concept because I don't think you can ever, it will always be an open wound, right? You're never going to look back and be like, all right, you know, fine. I think it will always be painful, and it should be painful. And I'm very interested in the continuities of fascism. I think we see it never really went away. It's still in the language. It's in the way we look at people. It's in the fascist movements, you know, the people who shave their heads and kill people in the street. Like 200 people have been killed, for instance, since reunification by neo-fascists. So I think it's something we still need to look at. And I'm also interested in this way of looking at people that comes from the colonies and was kind of finessed during those years. it's still, I think, very present, you know, the way you give value to different kinds of people. And you then had the guest workers, which is a whole new chapter that nobody ever talks about. It's like completely silenced. So I think they don't like it that I sort of go and poke around and be like, no, you're still Nazis, not, you know, it's like you still have problems. It's uncomfortable, I think, because also I think our narratives are very stuck. Like we have one version of our history and that's kind of that, and then we move on. And I think at the moment we're seeing also in Britain a really interesting moment where people reassess this and where you let other people look at it and they come up with very different stories. I don't know if you have similar movements here, but I think it's a kind of a special moment at the moment.
When we were talking in Liptovský Mikuláš yesterday, you said that some people in Germany called you a coward, but isn't that the opposite? Aren't they cowards for fearing your book in a way? And what's interesting for me as well is that you told me that the reaction in Austria was completely different. Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Oh, because they were they were our first victim. You know, they never got anything wrong. So I think because they find it very funny to laugh about the Germans, and which a lot of people do. I understand. I find it funny too. You know, but the Austrians, and they did a theater adaptation, for instance, and I did like radio interviews, and they found it all funny. But I think it comes from a point where they're not really willing to acknowledge their own share in it. I think it's still a very difficult conversation for them. And sometimes I would then turn around and be like, well, what about you, you know? And then they find it less funny because then, you know, it gets difficult because they obviously, you know, there's the famous play by Bernhard, the Heldenplatz, which was the biggest scandal in post-war theater because, you know, he pointed out the fact that the Heldenplatz, the big square in Vienna, wasn't empty when Hitler arrived. No, not exactly. They were like, so yeah, that was very interesting to see. Like, I had a good time in Vienna, but I feel like there's always a border, and if you like cross that, then people don't find it funny because you make them look at their own stuff. But as long as it's just laughing about us, then it's fine. We had a good time. They
never went through proper denazification process, right? Like
they didn't need it,
yeah.
You know?
Of course they didn't. We didn't either. Like Slovakia also pretends that we were the good guys.
No, the Austrians, I think they really have this narrative that they were victimized by us, which they were, but they were kind of willing victims, I'd say. No, they never, as far as I know, they haven't really, I mean, apart from, you know, like writers like Bernhard, I don't know if they're really having these conversations. I get a feeling that they're not having these conversations, or it's very, very difficult because I think it's a narrative that is stuck. And I met someone in London once who, because, you know, if your ancestors were Jewish and you had to leave Germany between 33 and 45, you can get the citizenship now. And I met someone in Austria whose parents or grandparents had to leave before because of the fascist government in Austria, but that's not acknowledged as a, you know, as a reason for leaving because officially that wasn't really the case. So
one of very important topics of this book is loneliness and the way the protagonist is unable to connect to basically almost any people around her, except for the doctor who doesn't talk back to her because he's performing something on the appointment that she's attending. We were talking about this yesterday, but the way you work with the topic of loneliness in this book is very specific as well. How does this topic fascinate you? Because it's something that I feel it's a bit hidden there, but it's very present at the same time.
I think it's a big topic. I think it's for me, it's a fascination that I have because I live in this city that's a monster, which is 10 million people. London is like, you know, a beast. And you have all these people and they're desperately lonely. So many people are lonely, I think. And there are even projects to end loneliness and we are seemingly so well connected, but we're not. And it's I don't really have a smart answer to it. I don't know why we can reach out to the whole world, but then we sit at home and we don't know what to do with our Sunday. And I think what it is in the book, though, I think is that she feels that the kind of, maybe the traditional structures have let her down, and that we need to find new structures of love and of sharing, because I feel like it's become very difficult to find places and things that people can share without paying for them, and kind of without, you know, it's become much harder, I think, to share public spaces, to share things with others. We've become kind of isolated by our comfort, I think, in many ways. And it's a topic that I find fascinating, and she's obviously very lonely, because also I think she hasn't found the kind of community in which she could be the person she would like to be, which I guess is sort of the next step. But there's something about, I think, a lot of contemporary societies that make life lonely for people. Yeah.
Another theme that's actually connected to loneliness in this book, and it's very important when it comes to the whole profile of the protagonist and her life decisions, is her family. You mentioned now that the traditional structures failed her, but what's interesting in this book is that her family, especially when talking about her mother and her father, mostly her mother, if you would look at them from a distance, not knowing what goes on in her head, you would think it's a normal, functional family. But then you know what she talks about and what she thinks, and how deeply she hates her mother in a way, in a very specific way, and blames her for a lot of stuff which she can't really influence. You can see that this seemingly normal, traditional family is actually a picture of destruction. How did you approach this topic, the family stuff?
I think it's the horror of the ordinary, right? It's the horror of exactly this, of, I think, a family that wants to conform and to be normal, and replicates a lot of the things that she finds oppressive, or that she suffers from. And I think on a very general level, I think that there is a problem with the representation of violence in a lot of contexts, because I think especially also violence that women suffer is always, if you look at it in films or something, it's always portrayed as something quite dramatic and quite big and sort of, but it's really quite banal, I think. And in her case as well, as obviously she doesn't suffer physical violence, but she suffers from patriarchal violence, I would call it. And that's in your everyday. And I think it's also, because most lives are very ordinary, right? Like lives are lives. And I think you need to look at that and the details. It's not about the big gestures. I think it's about the small stuff. And I think that's what I was interested in, that, you know, she comes from a seemingly normal family, but it's a place that doesn't make her happy. And so what if we rethink that? What if we think about, you know, urban families? What if we think about, because really what it's meant to be, I think, a structure of love or of support. And I think you can find that with other people as well. So yeah, I think, I'm interested in the ordinary and the banality of things, because everything is kind of banal. Life is quite banal. So I think it's important to kind of look there for things rather than, you know, somewhere else.
The protagonist has a lover, and we can probably say that this is the place where she's looking for the affection, but at the same time it feels like she's deeply mesmerized and fascinated by him, but also is unable to keep this relationship, and it sort of scares her. Why was this like relationship line important for you? Because for me it works a bit in like a companion piece to the family topic.
Yes, I think she goes, I think, for a lover where she knows it's probably never going to work. I think she sort of deliberately goes, because, you know, sometimes you go for a setup like when you have an affair with someone or whatever, you know, you go for a setup where you know that this isn't gonna be permanent, you know. It's like you have like like a door, like a back door where you can just leave, you know. And I think she does that because she, whilst she is in the position she is in, she isn't able to love someone, because I think you need, this always sounds very esoteric, but I think you need to be at peace with your own body and yourself before you can love someone else, or before you can care for someone else. And she isn't at that point. And I think her lover is her broken heart, and is also the loss that comes, I think the loss that comes with the decision to own herself, you know, because I think especially those kind of relationships, there's always quite a set idea of what a woman is meant to be, right? And she's like, I've got other ideas, but she still loves him, so it's complicated, you know. And life is obviously complicated, but I think he for me, he represents that loss, but also this thing that people do when I think they haven't found themselves yet, is they go for people that they know they can't really have, I think.
Of course, I need to ask you about the title. As I already mentioned at the beginning, the original was called and was published as The Appointment, but you also mentioned that the former title under which you submitted the manuscript was The Story of a Cock, or The Story of a Jewish Cock. Mm-hmm. And when you open the book, The Appointment, you can still see this subtitle, sort of. My main question is probably why, and why did you change it in the end?
I mean, I love the title, Jewish Cock. I find it very funny, also because my name is super German, so it's a funny combination, I think. But then, of course, it's in this day and age, especially, it's problematic. And someone at the publishing house was feeling worried that they have to call bookshops and say, I have this new book, and then get stuck. So we decided to, and I should probably say that The Appointment in English, there is a joke that doesn't travel because it's the Jewish people are the appointed people, so it's a bit of a lame joke, but there is a bit of a joke that doesn't travel. And then I have as a writer accepted that titles are never yours. I think it's your publishers who decide on your titles. And I'm very well behaved, so I always say, okay, fine. And I trust my editors where I don't speak the language, so I let them choose. If it's too offensive in their language, then I bow to it, you know. But I love what you've done. You've just kept the English title, which I think is a fair compromise, which some places have done. But the Russians and the Italians have translated that title, so, you know.
I'm still shocked by the fact that there is a Russian translation of this.
Yes.
If it were up to you, would you keep the original title?
Yeah, I love the original title. I also think it's funny, and I also think that it's an interesting thing where it's often people getting upset on someone else's behalf, i.e. the behalf of the Jewish people. But the Jewish readers I've met and the Jewish editors I've had, they like, my American editor was Jewish and she wanted to keep it, you know. So it's like, I think it's one of those awkward moments where people preempt something without talking to those who are actually concerned by it, you know. So I would have kept it, but I'm a good author, so I give up my titles if I have to.
Have you encountered any protests in any country where it was published?
Hate mail? No, I mean, all in all, it was actually very warmly received. I had a lot of nice surprises. Lots of like lovely elderly women reading it and loving it. I had like a very uncomfortable book launch in Germany, obviously, because they had no love for me, but it's okay. I think your own people always hate you the most. It's fine. No, I think it's okay. I mean, sometimes people they think I'm a yeah, they obviously think I'm a bit strange, but no, I was surprised, or maybe they just didn't tell me. I also think if you really trash it, then you're gonna look like some sort of right-wing nutter. Like, you know, it's difficult, but no, it's been good. It's been good. Yeah, the Germans didn't. I told you, no, there's a German radio adaptation now, like a radio play, and you can only listen to it between 10 at night and 6 in the morning. So not to corrupt the good German youth. So yeah, but it's okay.
That makes it more desirable, doesn't it? Like it's something very exclusive and secret.
Yeah, it's like in Russia with the 18+ sticker. It obviously is very appealing to anyone under the age of 18, which I think is something they haven't really taken into account.
So they gave you the sticker in Russia?
Yes, I have the 18+ sticker, and I have to be wrapped in plastic. So people can't browse in the shops and be corrupted.
It happens in Turkey as well, right? Like they wrap the books in plastic. Was this, there is going to be, or is it
There's
already?
going to be a Turkish edition, yeah.
So it will be wrapped in plastic.
Yeah,
probably.
I'll be wrapped in plastic, very solid plastic probably.
Because I saw a picture of the Heartstopper comics in Turkish translation, which was just wrapped in a lot of plastic. And it just says the title on the plastic and 18+, which is obviously a comic book for young adults, but yeah.
And also the thing they haven't understood is that there are electronic books. So I think, but
maybe you need to scan your ID before you can access the
and
e-book.
read after 10 o'clock.
Yeah. I want to ask you about your literary identity. As we already mentioned, you spent 19 years of your life in Germany, and despite the fact that you wrote the book in English, when you read it, you can really feel the German literature in it, in a way, in the way you work with sentences and obviously in the topics. Do you do you ever think whether you're more of a part of a German literary scene or the British one, or do you have some contemporaries in either British or German literature that you feel like do something similar, or if not similar, like you feel related to them in a way?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, though. I always kind of take comfort that I don't fully, I think, belong to either of them, but I think that's okay, because I think we're also very stuck in our ideas of like mother tongue and our ideas of national identity, and so I quite like it to be quite fluid, which is difficult for Wikipedia, but no, I think there are more and more people though who are sort of between cultures, or people who write in languages that aren't their first language. And of course, I'm very influenced by the German, and it's my mother tongue, and I read a lot in German, and I quite like the fact that it's kind of both in the same place, because I will of course never be really considered a British writer, because sometimes they think I'm in translation, and I'm like, no, I'm not in translation. Also, they find it very hard to understand that people have a second language and they write in that language, and because, you know, they're very monolingual usually. But I quite like it that way. I think it's quite a free space when you're sort of just floating in your own little universe, and I think there are more and more people maybe floating in that. In Germany, there's quite a strong tradition now, I think, of people writing in their second language, and I think it's the more interesting stuff that comes out of it at the moment. So yeah, no, I think it's a happy place, but it's you know, sometimes I wouldn't be eligible for a prize because I'm not a British citizen, and I was like, why, you know, why are you like, but it's obviously a mechanism of exclusion. But I'm also not eligible for a lot of grants and things, so
so sorry.
It's okay, it's fine.
When we were reading the first 3 pages, one thing I kept thinking about is, well, it's mentioned there as well, but I feel like far-right ideologies and fascism and Nazism and even the contemporary conservative far-right parties in Europe and in the US and so on, there's something very kinky about it, very sexual in the way they work with energy and their like libido and the way they talk, the way they work and the way they think. Why do you think there's this weird connection between hateful ideologies and sex?
Because I think it's a form of violence, and people find violence quite kinky, I think. And also I think this kind of worship and this kind of, you get to this, I think there's also something, you know, when you worship a dictator or a religion, I think it's quite sexual too, and it probably taps into similar parts of your brain. And I think to get to this kind of ecstasy, it's a sexual element. And I think also hate obviously comes from a similar place where love comes from. No, it's just corrupted and strange. But I think often also there is a sexual fascination with your enemy. No, I think there is, like, you can see that in, for instance, in accounts of like slavery in North America, that obviously the female slaves have been sexualized quite a bit. So I think there is a sort of something strange happening in these people's heads. But obviously it's a huge taboo to talk about it. But, you know, things like topless Mussolini or topless Putin. I mean, there was no topless Hitler because he wouldn't have worked, I think. But, you know, there is this, I think it is kind of sexual. It's like the film we talked about, the Ulrich Seidel film with the
Paradise Fate.
Yeah, with a scene where someone masturbates with a crucifix. I think even Jesus, you know, is like this naked young man on a cross. Like, you know, it's like
visible muscles stretched.
Yeah, it's quite a kinky pose, no, if you think about that. So, and I think this energy of the right-wing parties, I think there's something about kind of, I think of this collective excitement that that is aroused in people. Which I think also is weirdly sexual sometimes. So, but yeah, you can't talk about that, I think. I mean, you can, but yeah.
And you should, I think.
Yeah, I think you should. But it's people don't really go there, I think. So, but I think it's also maybe, I sometimes wonder if it's the only way to do it. To kind of, because if you mesmerize people like that, and if you sort of brainwash them, you have to kind of wash their entire brain, I guess, and that probably includes the sort of sexual fascination, you know. So
it's also interesting that the same people are usually very like sexually strict, like they don't want to talk about this stuff at all. They are very prudent, very conservative, and at the same time there's this aspect.
Yeah, and then they're caught in Brussels, like doing sort of weird orgies.
Yeah.
But but I think it's this thing of a repression, right? And and then maybe you become like this. I don't know, because you hate the world, because you have to repress yourself. But I think it's I think if bodies are at peace, then it's I don't know, a more beautiful society, I think. But obviously, that's not what they want.
Let's see if there are maybe some questions from the audience. If you want to ask anything, just raise your hand, either in English or in Slovak. I can translate.
Yeah, I have a question. Eventually, your book translates it into German. Did you have any? Did you play like a large part in dealing with the translation itself? Like, did you actually like help translate or like?
Yeah, I have a really cool translator. I love her, Milena, she's called. And we worked, I mean, she did the translation, obviously, but we worked on it together, and it was a really beautiful process. And she taught me a lot about German that I think I didn't know. So, and it was really fascinating to get to work with her. And it's obviously a very unusual situation, which she first found a bit daunting, I think, because from the book, people always think I'm this kind of lunatic. And but then it's really nice. It's a very close relationship, and we work together on other projects as well. And she's like, it's funny, but for me, she's become like my voice in German, like completely. I'm just sort of like, whenever I write something and it's translated, I always want it to be translated by her, because I feel like she sounds the way I should sound in German, I think, which I don't do if I write in German myself.
Anyone else? Don't be shy. No. It's the time. Yeah. You have
time.
You have. Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
How about, okay, like you started living in Britain from 19 years old, so it's been a couple of years, let's say. When did you feel confident enough in the language, like to write or did you just came naturally, or did you ever struggle with it?
This is it's a bit of a funny story maybe. So when I have imposter syndrome. Whatever I do, I always feel like I shouldn't be there doing these things because someone will find out that I'm incompetent. So I tried writing things in German, and as I said, they were terrible. But there's this is kind of a beautiful story. So there's this German editor that I've always loved, and he always loved me. And but he was like, we can't publish this, it's kind of terrible. But he said, why don't you write something in English? And I've always been like this all my life. It's like people will be like, why don't you apply to this university? And I would do it and then go there and study there. And he has now set up his own publishing house, and he's gonna, like, there's a new novel and he's gonna publish it. So it's like we've waited for each other for many years. But it was kind of a whim. Like, I do a lot of things out of a whim, and I was in Berlin, weirdly, and I started writing something in English, and it felt like, it's like finding a color, it's finding something that works for you, I think. And in this case, it's the language. So, yeah, it's really because someone was like, why don't you try writing in English? And I was like, okay, fine, you know. And it was like a sort of revelation. It was like a bit of a miracle.
Did you actually find it easy at that point?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, it did come very naturally. And even now it comes very naturally. And it's also something I think that people always forget, because they say, oh, it's your mother tongue. But if you live abroad for many years, then you lose some of it. Like my German, it happens to me that people are like, oh, why is your German so good? Or you speak with an accent, or, you know, it has like, it morphs. And I think it's nice. Like you can see your life reflected in your languages, I think, you know, and they change and they move, and they, like, I forgot a lot of proverbs, and if I go, it's, obviously I can speak it and I understand it, but yeah, no, I think it's in flux, which I think is a beautiful thing, I think. I don't know. I've accepted it. I'm kind of terrible at, but no, I'm not. But, you know, it changes, I think, with you. So, and that's, I think, okay.
This is your final chance. 10 seconds. Three seconds. No.
Bedtime. Oh.
Wonderful.
Oh. Was he staring at you?
No.
So you talked about dealing with the past. I think it's also something we really feel, even like in Slovakia in these days. Do you have any advice if you have like people around you who are not able to deal with the past, like the collective one, or also it doesn't need to be past, but also the present, like what's happening in the culture you are not really like happy with. So do you have any advice how to talk to people who are not able to deal with the past?
You mean who don't want to talk about it? Or who are afraid of the conversation? Or
Like, if you have someone who you like a lot, but you know they have a very different feeling about like events that happened in the past or are happening at the moment. So if you have any tips how to reach to these people.
I think it's obviously a big question for all of us at the moment, because I think that's happening in different countries. I always think I always find it helpful to take it to quite a personal level, because I think we always have very abstract conversations about the past. But I think if you can get people to look at themselves, look at their own families, look at their own kind of who they really are, that's obviously the place where it hurts, I think. But I think it's I think it's that I think is quite strong, but also I think it's important, I think, to have different narratives about the past and to kind of allow for the different narratives, and also it's things like books or television. You know, I think it's so important who writes these things, and, you know, maybe to confront people like this with other narratives and, you know, other versions. But I think it's it can be difficult to reach people, and I think I always find it, I don't know, I find it quite effective to be honest about things myself, you know, and to be like, yeah, this is what I am, you know. And the other day, for instance, in Germany, it was quite funny. There was a big debate because people always refer to people whose parents weren't German to people with a sort of migration background. And then one of these people with a migration background said, well, why don't we refer to you as people with a Nazi background, you know? Which obviously is quite radical. But I think it's quite interesting because I think it's also about visibility. I think I'm always a big fan of name and shame, for instance, the kind of, you know, now in Germany it's way too late, but they kind of drag like 5 people out of retirement homes and put them in front of a court because of the crimes they have committed. And I think it's really important. And I think also what's important, for instance, is like local projects. There are some amazing local projects where people, you know, at schools or whatever, they say like what happened like right here, you know, not abstract and not big, but what happened in, you know, in this town, who are the people who've been harmed. And I think that's also really important, the kind of local narratives, because I think that's where people get their stories from. And for instance, where I come from, there's it's still there, it's like it's huge institutions with people who have like mental health issues or are, you know, have disabilities, and obviously these people were killed in these institutions under fascism. And I think that's really touching. I think if you make it, I think if you go away from the big narratives but go to like in front of your own door, basically, or preferably behind your own door, you know. And I always felt like that's a way of reaching people if it becomes so personal, you know. So I think those are ways of doing it. But I know these conversations are very difficult, and obviously the past is something that is not very tangible, no? Or you have to find ways to make it tangible, I think. And I know that some people have moved beyond rationality. Like we had a horrible case in Germany, but I think very symptomatic is there's a concentration camp outside Berlin, which is like the model concentration camp. It's very well curated, first curated in the GDR and now curated, you know, in the West. And the people from the AfD, which is the new fascist party in Germany, they went on a tour. And then they said, oh no, but these are all lies, you know, this is not what happened here, you know. And they got kicked out. But I think that's symptomatic of what's happening at the moment, is that people would just have the kind of, I don't know, indecency to walk into a place like this and say, oh, but what you're saying is a lie because they've been on Facebook all day, or I don't know. So I think it's hard at the moment. I think it's really hard. But yeah, I think those are my thoughts. I don't know if you have any thoughts, but it's difficult, I think.
If there aren't any, huh?
I'm sorry for this question.
It's okay.
You want to ask about the rights again?
Yes, I like this question because I find out something. But there's a comparison on the cover with Bernard, and you mentioned him. So how you found this comparison, and if you can mention any other writer you like to read, even contemporary, from German or Britain.
I like the Bernard thing because also it came when they did the theatre adaptation in Vienna. They said, "Oh, your book reminded us of Bernard," and I was like, "Ooh, you know, I can die now." And I also think that the best German literature has always been written on the margins, like in Austria, like Ingeborg Bachmann, for instance, is another author I really admire. Contemporary German writers, there's a writer I really love, is Frank Witzel. He does something I think quite similar in the way he looks at the past and how it's still influencing us. I'm a big fan of his projects. Otherwise, she's American, but someone like Chris Kraus, I think, is really important. I'm also a big fan. It takes us into Mexico. Fernanda Melchor, I think, is a really cool writer. Han Kang. There are lots of like contemporary writers. I always have to visualize my bookshelf when I get asked this question. I'm always like going through the bookshelf. I'm reading. The most recent thing I was reading was Jane Austen. I feel like that's not just to relax my little brain. No, actually, I was also reading a book called Stregga by a Swedish writer called Johanna Likaholm, who's also actually really interesting on issues of violence against women, I think, and the situation of female bodies. I always read. I have usually a book in different languages at the same time because it's a way of organizing things in my brain. So there's always one in English, one in German, one in French, and but no, there are lots of people that. But it's always hard to pinpoint, I think, the exact influence. And sometimes, you reread something after 5 years, and you're like, oh God, this really influenced what I was doing. But it's not a conscious process, I think. But I don't know. I'm a big fan of the Austrian authors. Jelinek as well. I'm a Jelinek fan. So yeah.
So those were final book recommendations.
Yes, please go to your local bookshop.
You don't even have to go to a local bookshop, because if you want to buy Jewish Cock, you can buy it right here and Katharina will sign it for you. There are also some other books from Literárna Bašta Publishing House, if you want. I will be very happy if you do. And then you can go to your local bookshop to see a wider selection of books by other publishing houses and other writers. I would like to thank all of you for being here today and for listening to us and to asking questions. And first of all, I would like to very much thank Katharina Volckmer.
Thank you.